What's good, gamers? Aquilon here, and of course, welcome back to each and every one of you. Why MoP? Why now? Of course, you all know that Mists of Pandaria Remix was announced by Blizzard, and this led a lot of people to ask, well, why Mists of Pandaria? Why now? Is this similar to Season of Discovery, where Blizzard is seeping in little bits of lore here and there, tidbits of things that may not have been known at the time, and this is like the perfect opportunity to actually introduce those things to the world. So if you have new lore that you want to explore, but you want to make sure that that lore is grounded in some version of the past of World of Warcraft, Season of Discovery, and really the classic experiment overall, is a pretty decent way of doing that, and Blizzard have been doing so tremendously well. So why Mists of Pandaria? Is it similar? Is that why we're going back to Mists of Pandaria? Well, there are effectively two expansions that Blizzard could use for an experiment like this, at least the first one. From here, Blizzard could really experiment and try just about any expansion, because if this one works, people will be hyped for whatever comes next. But right off the bat, as a first try, there are two expansions in World of Warcraft that is widely considered to be some of the best expansions Blizzard have ever released. The first being Mists of Pandaria, and then Legion. The problem with Legion, it's pretty recent. Yes, I know it's actually been quite a few years ago, but it's still recent enough that one can, I guess, reliably assume that the majority of players that are still playing World of Warcraft today did play during Legion. If I'm to go off of my own comment section, there's a lot of people that will go, well, back in Legion. So clearly a lot of people did play during the Legion era, which means going back and doing this in Legion, while cool, not really, something new. Whereas I think there are a ton of players today that didn't play during Mists of Pandaria. Ladies and gentlemen, the World Soul Saga is upon us. And the World Soul Saga is going to be dealing with what? Well, old gods. It's pretty much there for all to see. In fact, it starts with the War Within. And what are we doing in the War Within? Well, we're chasing the Harbinger, or Xal'atath, as Xal'atath makes her way to the Nerubians, and a kingdom that we didn't know about. In fact, when the original Nerubian kingdom was destroyed and decimated by the Lich King, and basically they were all just made to serve the Lich King, we all sort of assumed that the empire of the Nerubians came to an end, because that's where the Nerubians are. But it turns out, no, that's not. There's another Nerubian empire, and this one seems to be largely intact. Now, of course, with Xal'atath making all manner of deals, we also see them actually evolving, becoming bipedal and all the rest of it. So there's some weird stuff going on with the Nerubians, but we find them there. The very next expansion is called Midnight, which is even more of a dead giveaway. I doubt that an expansion called Midnight is going to be dealing with Murlocs. Might be, but it won't, I think. They could surprise me. But I'm going to go out on a limb and say Midnight, Hour of Twilight, Darkness, kind of voidy. Sounds like the Void is going to be very, very busy in the World Soul Saga, and will only really, I think, break away from the Void elements of the expansions once we get to the Last Titan, where maybe we'll still deal with some of the aftermath of the Void, but we won't be dealing with the Void directly, unless, of course, they win in Midnight, in which case, yes, then we will be dealing with the Void directly, and I wouldn't mind that. Just gonna say. Alright, so Mists of Pandaria is actually the perfect expansion to go back to. Many people might say, well, wouldn't that be BFA? BFA dealt very heavily with the old gods. Yes, but not really with the history so much of the old gods. While, yes, we had the Whispers, and we had all of the phenomenal storytelling around, the Drust was introduced, and there seems to be a link there, and we had all of these old god creatures. The expansion that really dove into the oldest lore of old gods was Mists of Pandaria, mainly through the use of the Cluxi, or the Mantids. The Cluxi specifically being a sect of Mantids that did not fall to the corrupting voices of the old gods. The Cluxi is incredibly interesting because they worshipped the old gods, specifically Yisaraj, although they never, if I remember correctly, it's been a few years since I've done those quests, but if I remember correctly, they don't ever actively call Yisaraj. They simply refer to them as the terrible ones. It is their gods, they do worship them, but they do describe these gods as terrible, incredibly powerful, but not great, not really good guys. Right? They're not going to give you a treat when you do something well. The Kluxi also never really speak about where they hail from, so what created them. But I think we could argue if they're going to worship old gods, then maybe the old gods made them. You know? We also have the Nerubian Empire, also an empire that predates that of the Titan arrival. The Kluxi, by the way, predates the Titan arrival by a lot. That is a very, very old empire. And then we have the Faceless Ones, who, according to official canonical lore, is actually creations of the old gods themselves. But again, they do predate the Titan arrival by several thousands of years, because the Faceless Ones were actually involved in the wars that the old gods would have with one another. So we do have three distinct, I guess you could call, races. That is, at least one of them, two, the Faceless Ones, are present to some extent in Mists of Pandaria, but we do have the Kluxi that is in Mists of Pandaria, that is going to introduce a lot of players to new elements of the old gods. Now, this is where things start to get interesting for me from a speculation perspective, and that I think we should be talking about, specifically looking at the Kluxi. The Kluxi prove that the Titans lied, right? The Titans, their line, I've said this before, we've been speaking about this quite a lot on the channel. The Titans claim that nothing existed before they arrived. The Kluxi, the Mantids, the Nerubians, and the Faceless Ones prove that that is simply not true. These were not just beings that were running around being used by the old gods. The Kluxi had an empire. They had a civilization. They had a hierarchical structure. In fact, they had different groups of Kluxi. So they weren't just one big hive mind. There were actually multiple hive minds of the Kluxi. Some fell to the whispers of the old gods, I guess you could call it, and some didn't. Some remained free, even though they still worshipped the old gods. So proving, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that things existed long before the Titans actually arrived on Azeroth. But what's more important to me here is when we look at the earliest life on Azeroth, and we look at things like the Kluxi, like the Nerubians, even the trolls, even the goblins. Now, we'll get to the goblins, because there's something very interesting going on there as well. Life is incredibly chaotic. If we look in our world, in reality, so if we quickly take a break from Azeroth and we look at Earth, life is chaotic. There's a lot of beings on Earth that you look at and you kind of go, where the hell do you exist? Like, how do you even? Octopus, for example. What the hell is that thing, right? It's a weird creature, but that's life. It's chaotic. It throws a bunch of different stuff together, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it looks off, sometimes it looks beautiful. It really depends on, what happens and how the system and how the process plays itself out. And when I look at things like the Kluxi, things like the Akir, or the Mantids in general, not just the Kluxi, because Kluxi actually means priest in their language. So if I look at the Mantids, I look at the Akir, even the Faceless Ones, I look at early life on Azeroth, it looks to be incredibly chaotic. And of course, there's the argument that the old gods themselves are actually creations of Azeroth. They came from Azeroth. Now, there's no real evidence for that, except for the fact that the old gods seem to be incredibly connected to Azeroth, and all of the claims that the old gods are actively trying to corrupt Azeroth does not seem to hold true. Allow me to explain why I think taking the Titans at their word on this particular point is just bonkers. The Titans say that they arrive on Azeroth and they find these giant hulking bodies of flesh, and they are fighting and warring and driving the elemental lords insane, and all of the elements are being driven insane, and they realize that these beings are trying to corrupt Azeroth. So they reach down, they rip Yisaraj out of the planet, thereby creating a giant gaping wound that they would eventually order and nullify and then turn into the Well of Eternity. This is their claim. Well, there is one particular thing in the game, in the lore, that drives a giant stake into that story. And that is what happens exactly immediately after the freeing of N'Zoth. If the old gods indeed did tunnel into the world, burrowed into the world, their tentacles reaching in to try and corrupt the world, how then does N'Zoth manage to move himself from where he was chained into Ny'alotha? Now, Ny'alotha is also not entirely on Azeroth. It's sort of like a pocket dimension of Azeroth, but also not on Azeroth at all. It's a weird place. It's a very, very weird place. And even now, we don't have a lot of information about exactly what Ny'alotha is. But N'Zoth immediately takes his shit and he just goes out, right? And goes into Ny'alotha. Now, if N'Zoth had that ability, and according to the Titans, these were giant mountains of flesh burrowed into the planet, those two things are mutually exclusive as far as I'm concerned. Because if the old gods do indeed have the ability to move themselves, then they are not burrowed into the world in the way that the Titans argued. Because they would rip the planet apart just by trying to move. Or they have the ability to turn their bodies into smoke, in which case, how the hell did Aman'Thul rip Y'Saraj out of the planet? As soon as Aman'Thul reaches down, Y'Saraj literally just goes, I'm a cloud now. And Aman'Thul's just grabbing like this and nothing happens. So again, what the hell are you even talking about? When the Titans claim this, that one scene kind of destroys the narrative there. Now, there's an argument that you can obviously make and say, well, actually, N'Zoth was still there, but he sort of projected himself, like his active version, he projected into Ny'alotha. If that was true, then us taking down N'Zoth inside Ny'alotha is not actually killing N'Zoth, because we would have to go under the ocean and kill N'Zoth in there, right? That's where we would have to go if we're going to try and take down N'Zoth. You could also probably make the argument that actually, no, Akko, during our adventures inside Ny'alotha, we did actually make our way to where N'Zoth is in the planet and where he sits, and that's where we killed him. Okay, I'd be happy to accept that, in which case this video is completely useless and you don't even have to keep watching, although you've already watched for 14 minutes, so why don't we just finish, right? Okay, so there's another thing that really drives me insane, and I don't have evidence for this, but I'm gonna just say it. Aman'Thul created the Well of Eternity, not by killing Y'Saraj, but out of anger. Something happened on Azeroth. Something was there, or he saw something that he did not like, and I think he punched a hole into Azeroth. And I do not believe that that hole is filled with the blood of Azeroth, because it does not act like the blood of Azeroth. We have two instances in World of Warcraft of where we see the blood of Azeroth. The one is Khajiit, which is a kind of ore, but it acts exactly like Azerite, even though it looks different. So the sword of Sargeras somehow changed the color and the consistency of Azerite. But if you listen to Gallywix, when he speaks to Sylvanas, he explains to her that it acts exactly. The last time he saw something like this, it was Khajiit. So there, it confirms that Khajiit and Azerite is the same thing, and we know that Azerite is the blood of Azeroth, at least if Magni is to be believed. And we just saw a giant sword go into the planet, so, you know, putting one and one together should give us two, unless, of course, it is actually three, in which case, again, I might be lying. Khajiit had incredible properties exactly the same as Azerite. Why, then, did that not happen with the Well of Eternity? If the blood of Azeroth was indeed seeping out of the planet, and somehow Y'Saraj wasn't able to turn into a giant cloud and just go away, much like his brother Nazoth did, then why did that blood become just a giant pool? It makes no sense. Unless you realize why the well had to be created in the first place. And this little nugget of truth comes from Dragonflight and the Ruby Life Pools. If you go to the Ruby Life Shrines and you do the quest line associated with the Ruby Life Shrine, you find that the waters coming from tiers, the upper spire there, can't remember the name now, completely blanking on it. Those waters were infected with order. Effectively, the water itself was what transformed the dragons inside their eggs into ordered beings. We know that the Titans and their creations experimented with this because that's where the goblins come from. It was the Titan Keeper that fed Kazumite to a number of species and then somehow accidentally created the goblins. So we know that they experiment with these things, and we know that this is a tried and true method of theirs because they did that on the Dragon Isles. And I think that's exactly what the Well of Eternity was. It is not the blood of Azeroth. It's never been the blood of Azeroth. When you look at what is directly below the Well of Eternity, it is also not the heart of Azeroth. It is not where Azeroth is. It is the portal into Deepholm, which sits very deeply in Azeroth, but Azeroth is still not there. So by ripping Yisaraj out of that place, you would not actually be destroying Azeroth. You'd be destroying maybe Deepholm, maybe the World Pillar to some extent, but you would not be destroying Azeroth, at least not at the time. Again, based on the knowledge we have right now. No, those waters were created by the Titans themselves. And the whole point and reason for those waters was to bring order to the denizens that then existed on Azeroth. Beings that were chaotic, filled with life, but had no order, would all coalesce around the Well of Eternity because it is the strongest source of water, fresh water specifically, on this super continent that the Titans now had built. And this meant that their order influence could now flow out to all of the denizens of Azeroth, bringing order to the world. And ultimately, we see races like the elves pop up after trolls, funnily enough, moved to the Well of Eternity, which points even more to my very old theory at this point, that the trolls were also either a creation of the old gods or a creation of Azeroth herself. And it was order that turned the trolls from their native look into elves. Now, why are the old gods where they are? Well, I've spoken about this before at length, and I spoke about this with Pyromancer as well. It's to create the Umbral Veil. You see, if you go into the Chronicles, it says there that Kalimdor, the Land of Eternal Stars at the time, wasn't the only giant continent on Azeroth. It was simply one of the largest continents on Azeroth. And the Titans chose that continent as their continent. That was the place that they were going to build their ordered creation. That was the place where they were going to house all of their engines, all of their control mechanisms, but they needed to keep something out. There is something very dangerous on the outskirts outside of our little existence, kept out by a thing known as the Umbral Veil. And we only know this name thanks to Azshara. Azshara is said to have made her way beyond the Umbral Veil, and I believe it's because the Umbral Veil has now been weakened. And the reason it's been weakened is the beings that were powering the Umbral Veil, a giant protective bubble, if you will, that kept certain beings out of our little creation. That Umbral Veil has now been weakened because the old gods are no more, and their prisons was meant to power this Umbral Veil. The Well of Eternity was meant to bring order. The prisons were meant to protect the Well of Eternity. Protect from what? Well, who knows? The Harbinger of the Void is clearly here for a reason. What that reason could be? Perhaps it's the fifth old god that we saw in the novel. Just one old god. Kind of smallish, not that large, still there. And we know that a fifth old god, it used to be 5. Then it got turned into 4, and maybe we're back to 5. Maybe that old god was so powerful that the Titans had no shot of defeating it. And so they simply locked it out. They kind of like that. They kind of do that often. And that may be where we end up next. Anyways, I've taken up enough of your time, ladies and gentlemen. If you liked the video, hit the like button. If you didn't, hit the dislike button. $1 a month gets you access to nothing, actually. It just helps you keep this channel free from sponsorships. They want to sell you shit that you do not need. $1 a month. Link is in the description down below. Please leave a comment. Let me know what you think of the video. And as always, be kind to each other. Be good to each other. And I will see all of you in the next one. Peace.